Starting a business is never easy, and I quickly learned that when I started mine. I've been spending a lot of time creating stock standard laser cut products to sell, items that can produce quickly to keep the finances ticking over so I can have some breathing room to work on more intricate and time consuming products. Well, that was the plan. However, despite my efforts, I've had limited success and it's been really frustrating. To take my mind off things for a while, I've decided to go back and work on what I originally set out to do by creating a range of unique woodwork products outside of my comfort zone, starting with some small scale woodwork products and working my way up from there. This first set of products won't be new to the woodwork community in terms of their function, but I'm going to put my spin on them in terms of their aesthetics. I'm going to combine my artistic ability with my love of laser cutting technology to create a range of woodwork products inspired by my childhood drawings. And now I've pulled the trigger on this idea, I've found my motivation again. If for no other reason than to create a record of all the madness that goes through my head, I'm going to document my design process in a series of videos starting with this one. You'll get to see how I take an idea from concept to finished product. So no more moaning, let's get on with it. I hope you enjoy. So when I was a kid, I'd draw a heap of different pieces that incorporated intricate patterns. These drawings consisted of geometric shapes, optical illusions, checkers and spiderweb patterns, you name it. Now I want to incorporate those same themes and bring them to life through a series of timber projects. Taking inspiration from those childhood drawings but actualising them in a completely different way through woodwork, computer-aided design and manufacture. I like to start projects with a range of concept sketches to brainstorm possible ideas to see if anything pops out at me. I find this a very important part of the process. Essentially, I just aim to get ideas out of my head and onto paper so that I can think about things clearer. And this process can be completed many times over. There is no limit. For this specific session, I came up with a few ideas for a range of different types of boxes, such as jewellery, tea and bandsaw boxes. But the one that popped out at me the most was an old school timber tissue box cover. I chose this design mainly because I've just completed a few of these recently and I think it might be a good starting point to ease into this series. After choosing a tissue box cover for project 1, I explored a number of variations for patterns and shapes that I thought might work the best with it. Here I roughly sketched out some ideas that included optical illusions, spiderweb designs, checkered patterns, distorted and straight line patterns. Looking at patterns in 2 dimensions is fine to start with, but I needed to understand what these patterns might look like in 3D, and it made me think about doing these patterns as a waterfall edge design. When I sketched these ideas quickly in rough 3D format, I liked the idea of the optical illusion and spiderweb patterns the best. So I elaborated and explored these options in more detail, and it was these 2 ideas I started to progress through to the next stage. Before proceeding to any CAD drawings, I needed to gather up some measurements to use. So I quickly measured up the length and width and height of the standard tissue box, and I also noted down the size and shape of the opening in the top of the box so that I can incorporate and consider how that shape will affect the design. Computer-aided design, such an important tool for me. Without it, the time it takes to experiment with different trains of thought is phenomenally longer. Not to mention the costs involved in material and production hours. And most importantly, CAD gives you a more accurate understanding of how your products will look and differ in real life, in comparison to what you had in your head, or even to how much designs will differ from your sketches when it's drawn out to scale. What I first did here was take my measurements and plot them out onto a 2D drawing. The internal red lines represent the size of the tissue box, whilst the black lines represent an approximation of the thickness of the timber, and the oval in the middle is the profile of the tissue box opening. I've placed the layout like this to represent how the design would be cut in one continuous piece of timber for a waterfall edge to work, and this will become clearer soon. What you can see here is where I've started plotting out some patterns on a duplicate of the template, and this is why CAD work is so important for me. I put a series of rings in this design, rippling out from the centre of the box cover, increasing the size of each ring by 5mm in comparison to the previous ring. However, I immediately knew this was not the effect I was after, and I would not be achieving the desired result that I wanted. So what I did here is, instead of increasing the rings by a further 5mm in both directions, I increased only the horizontal expansion of the rings by a further 5mm than the previous ring. So adding 5mm as I go. But I increased the vertical expansion of the rings by a constant 5mm, not an additional 5mm like the opposite direction. And what this did to the pattern was the effect I was after. It gives more of an optical illusion. It's drawing the viewer's attention into the center of the piece. And when I added the blocking out of color, I achieved the result that I wanted. This is probably a good time to mention that the pattern that I'm designing here is going to be laser engraved into the timber. I'll do some tests to also see if I can achieve a resin pour using the laser to create channels for the pour. Once I got the design right, I had to refine it a little more to accurately reflect how the pattern would be laid out on the timber to be laser engraved. So what I'm doing here is removing any of the pattern that spills over from the net plan, then creating 3 individual separated pieces of the pattern for each of the parts required to make the design. Why? Well, there are always ways you can complete a waterfall edge pretty accurately without losing too much material between your cut. But because I'm going to complete these waterfall edges on a table saw, I will lose material the thickness of the blade between each section. So I need to allow for that loss of material so that the pattern will line up perfectly when it changes direction and spills over the edge of the box. Whilst I'm here, we might as well talk about material selection. Many factors come into play when it comes to selecting material. I won't go into too much detail, but for this project, I've chosen Tasmanian Oak, as it is a light coloured hardwood with a consistent straight grain, which will make it good for contrasting against the darker engraving or casting of darker patterns into the timber. And because Tasmanian Oak is always stocked at the hardware store closest to where I live, it means that I can source it at a moment's notice without having to keep so much stock on my shelves, which saves me on storage. Now back to the measuring and planning phase. What I'm doing here is setting up the cross-cut sled that I'm going to use to cut the waterfall edges. I'm going to use my digital calibration tool to set my blade at 45 degrees. I've then set up a piece of scrap timber which I've cut to the height of the Tasmanian oak I'll be using. Once I've done this, I have that Tasmanian oak as a guide to measure the distance across the top of the timber to see how much waste material is going to be removed from the cut. I measured this out and noted that I'll lose just under 6mm of material with the waterfall cut. So I measured a 6mm gap on a scrap piece of material to double check if this was accurate. Then as you can see here, once I passed through the 6mm gap, the guideline is just visible either side of the waste cut line, so we are good to go with using 6mm as a guide for separating the pattern to be laser engraved on the top and sides of the boxes. Now that I know my gap required is 6mm to allow for the saw blade clearance, I'm going to adjust this back in my CAD drawing. I've copied that pattern and layout into a new file to make those adjustments. Selecting each part and separating the gap by 6mm allows for an accurate depiction of how this will look on the piece of timber. So you can see down here, this is my guide template, and this one up here is my top laser template. Just to give a better idea of what this will look like in the timber, I'll drag and drop a texture layer in here. Again, another added benefit of completing CAD work is things pop up that you might forget, but instead of wasting material, you can make the changes on the drawings instead. For instance, this layout template is suited for a timber waterfall feature where the sides of the box would be as thick as the ends of the box. But for this design, this is not the case. I'm going to use 3mm panels on the sides, which makes the timber much narrower. So I'm adjusting the drawing now to accommodate that change. I'll add in the panels here to reduce the width of the template like so, and bear with me, in the next step you'll see how all this comes together in a 3-dimensional CAD model. And just like that, here we are with a 3D model that I've drawn up in SolidWorks. I won't go into full detail of the model here as I believe that content is worth a video in itself. What I will do though is point out a few of the details in the design that I'm happy with and a few issues that creating this CAD model allowed me to identify. So you can see here the pattern lines up nicely on the edge of the design, allowing the pattern to continuously spill over the waterfall edge. And you can see here from the top view, this is what the piece would look like when being laser engraved. The only difference being is that now the pieces are pushed together and there is no longer the 6mm gap in between each piece. So when the pieces are folded like so, the pattern continues over the edge. Originally, I had thought to do two versions of this design, one filled with resin and one just engraved, but looking closer at this model, I've realised that this won't be possible. Due to the angle of the 45 miter and how it lines up with the pattern, it would actually move too much material, leaving a gap, ruining the pattern. As this little piece here cannot just float in mid-air, it wouldn't work. Again, another problem solved with a model without having to find this out in real life, which would have wasted material and time. Another benefit of the CAD model is that you can triple check your measurements from the model, which I'm doing now. And as per usual, I've found a little mistake here where the grooves that I've included for the panels are set too far in from the edge. These were only supposed to be in 3mm, not 5. A quick fix to move them over, and we're now ready to convert this model into a working drawing to take into production. So just quickly, the beauty of modern CAD software is that once you've created a 3D model, exporting it to a drawing can be completed in a click of a few buttons. I'm not concerned with any Australian standards for sheet layout or presentation here. I'm merely just using this function to communicate the basic measurements that I need and can understand well enough to make the actual product from. You could spend hours learning how to do everything to industry standards, but for a small project like this, I simply don't find it necessary. I've just used a few annotation features here to plot out the basic dimensions and hidden details that I need, then converted the drawing into a PDF for easier viewing, and also so I can print it out and have a hard copy with me in the workshop to work with. Onto the production. What I'm starting with here is a length of Tasmanian Oak, slightly longer and wider than what I require. This is so that I have a little bit of material to play with when it comes to finishing off the nice crisp edges of the design. So you can see here in my Coral Draw file that the overall dimensions of this pattern are 490 by 129, but I'm actually going to put a piece of timber in the laser that's 500 by 135. So what I'll do here is just create a little boundary box to represent the shape of the timber, then center the design within it. Once I've done that, I can send the print to the laser program. I've pre-sanded this piece of timber to ensure the grain is as low as possible for smooth laser engraving. I've also used a rule to measure the diagonals and find the center of the board. Now in the Epilog Job Manager, I need to configure the advanced settings to laser from the center of the board, not from the XY axis. Once that's ready, I can complete my engraving settings. There is a bit going on here, so the first thing I'm going to do is turn off any features that are not required, just leaving the pattern I want engraved. And a quick tip here is, the higher the power and the slower the speed of the laser, the darker it will burn. This often leaves residue, sap burn or resin burn from the timber around the edges of the design. So what I do is keep the power right up, but also turn the speed up as well. What this will do is vaporize the timber rather than burn it so much. You will, however, need to do multiple passes as the laser won't be removing as much material on each pass. This process does take a little longer, but you're going to end up with a much cleaner result. So I'm going to start with 3 passes, followed by moving my laser bed focused height down and then running another 3 passes. I'll check the depth at this point and decide where to go from there. So what I'm doing here now is a bit of an experiment. I've tried resin pouring on Tassie Oak before and I got a fair bit of leakage down the grain and had some bubbles continue to escape from the timber. So what I'm doing here is using a clear coat to hopefully seal the timber in a little bit so that when I pour in the resin it'll stay more contained inside the lasered grooves. Next is the resin pour. To stop the resin going absolutely everywhere, I've used tuck tape to wrap around the edges to make a little waterproof bathtub to confine the resin. I'm using black diamond pigment. This will give the pattern a dark colour, and I'm interested in seeing how the semi-translucent effect turns out, as this resin won't be pitch black. It'll be very dark with a subtle glint throughout it. Resin requires a deal of accuracy in the pour. I choose to mix resin by weight rather than volume, using a micro scale. Always making sure I have a respirator on for this process, as the fumes are pretty harsh on the old lungs. This resin is a 2-to-1 mixture, and once stirred through thoroughly, I've transferred the resin from one cup to another, and this leaves behind any stubborn saturated pigment that hasn't mixed well, leaving a consistent mixture in the second cup. I really need to invest in some distributing syringes for this process, but for now I'm just pouring directly from the cup into the engraved pattern, where you can see the resin mixture is dark but still slightly translucent, giving off a glitter or pearl effect. Once the resin is evenly distributed, a torch is used to pop any bubbles in the resin, leaving a glass-like finish. Once the resin has set, It's time to sand down the excess and leave the pattern exposed. During this process, I first second guessed my material selection wasn't that great, as I could see some stubborn grain poking through the resin. But on closer inspection, I realised it was more that the resin hadn't bound properly. I contacted the supplier and I was soon informed that I'd used the incorrect resin and I need to use a different kind for such a shallow pour. Live and let learn, as they say. However, as this design is more of a proof of concept at this stage, more than anything else, I continued with the build. To ensure the most accurate transition between the soon-to-be three pieces, whilst the timber was still in one piece, I ran it through the table saw, ripping a channel for the side panels to slide into. I'll be using 3mm acrylic panels, which is conveniently the same thickness as the saw blade, so this comes in very handy, especially considering if I get this right, I'll be looking at producing small batches of these boxes and will need to do this process efficiently. Once the panel channels were ripped, I cut the waterfall edges on my table saw sled. I ensured to use my trusty digital calibration tool on the blade to set my miters to 45 degrees, then proceeded. This is kind of where the magic happens and would be the make or break test for my design. Using a piece of waste material as a guide, I lined up the spacing that I had allowed in the design and hoped for the best. To be honest, I was quietly confident with this one, and once the cuts were completed, I did a quick alignment check and I was happy with how things were looking. From there I moved on to the glue up. I like to use masking tape to help align and hold miters in place when gluing up boxes. Once the tape was in place, Titebond Ultimate 3 was used for the glue. I had a pre-cut spacer to assist in holding the box in place. Then to add an extra level of firmness and support, I used a nylon band clamp to secure the box. To cut the hole in the top of the box to access the tissues, I quickly created a router template on Coral Draw and I laser cut it out on 4mm acrylic. Ideally I'd use 6 to 10mm acrylic for this, but this is all I had lying around. Once I had the template, I quickly traced out where the hole was going to go, then using a Forstner bit, I drilled some relief holes before cutting away most of the excess material using a jigsaw. After that, I used some masking tape on the job as well as the template to act as a separator for some very strong double-sided carpet tape. This holds the router jig or the template in place whilst using a flush trim router bit to get a nice neat opening. Then I just finished off the inside with a 3mm chamfer. Before making and inserting the side panels, due to easier access, I applied a finish to the main body of the box. Nothing special, just a simple timber oil to suffice for a proof of concept prototype. I used a fine thread microfiber cloth here, but it would be advisable to use a proper application cloth or a cheesecloth rag for optimal results. Had this be the final product, ready for the consumer, this is what I would have done. I like to wear gloves for the application process for no other real reason that I hate getting finish stuck all over my hands. Now I know it's not traditional, but I really like incorporating matte black acrylic panels into a lot of my woodwork products, as I just really love the contrast and the low sheen. So I quickly drew up a cutting profile and lasered them out to size to complete the install. As acrylic won't bond to timber that well using wood glue, I used a little bit of CA glue to keep the panels in place, but as the channels were cut perfectly, they're mainly held in under friction. I think that the black panels put a modern spin on traditional items. Unfortunately, the drawback is that the material isn't that ecologically sustainable, but it is very durable and stylistically sustainable, which does have its benefits also. Anyway, there we have it. That's the prototype or proof of concept complete. I really like how the pattern draws the eye of the viewer into the center of the design, with the overall rings getting smaller and smaller as they disappear into the middle of the box. Am I completely happy with the project? No. There are a few things here and there I'd change, especially with the laser settings, maybe the material selection and the resin type, as well as the router jig slipped a little bit when I was cutting out the final hole. But all in all, I think the product worked well as a proof of concept, and I'm ready to complete another one to the level of consumer quality and then list it for sale to see if the general public agrees. Now that I've proved that the laser resin pattern planned out this way works well for waterfall edges, I'm going to start branching out into other laser patterns I can trial that not only fall in one direction but multiple directions. So not just over the ends but also over the front and back faces as well. So I might look into some jewelry boxes for my next attempt. This concludes part 1 of the series. If you'd like to see how these designs progress, please like and subscribe and turn your notifications on so you're the first to see the progression of these childhood inspired projects as they come to life.